Alright guys, this is it, the last video in our KC Highlights conversion series. In part 1, we installed the Pro 6 LED light bar. Part 2, we installed the Slim Light 8 off-road lights. And in part 3, we installed the Gravity Pro 7 headlights. In this video, we're going to be doing all the little lighting stuff, primarily, more specifically, the rock lights, the roof lights, and the rear lights. Now, we don't just use these lights when we're hitting the trails and off-roading. In fact, more often than not, I am using these lights as scene lighting at camp. But therein lies my dilemma. Right now, all my off-road lights are tied to a switch pod that's hooked up to the starter battery of my vehicle. When we're on the trail, it's not a problem. The vehicle is running and charging up that battery. The problem arises when we get to camp and I want to turn on these lights. Well, because it's hooked up to the starter battery of my vehicle, I don't want to run the risk of running these lights too long or it'll kill my starter battery and I wake up the next day and the vehicle won't turn on. That is something I definitely want to avoid. Not to mention, this switch pod that I have is hooked up to the ignition. So in order for me to turn any of these scene lights, I have to put the key in the ignition just to be able to turn them on, and it's kind of a pain to do that. But today I'm going to show you how I'm going to do my install to where I can still utilize these when the vehicle is in motion and we're hitting the trails, but also how I'll be able to use them at camp and run them for much longer without the risk of it killing my starter battery. So this is definitely not our standard lighting install, so stick around because I know that some of you might want this kind of a setup. So let's just jump right into it. All right, so let's start with the Cyclones because I feel like this is the easiest one. Everything you need to install rock lights on your vehicle all comes in this one kit. You're going to get 6 wiring harnesses, plug and play on one end. It plugs right into your Cyclones. You also get a negative battery post, your button. You also get this block right here, which is a nice touch. If I didn't already run basically a switch pod system, this is great to have. So this is a distribution block and you would wire this up to your button, and then on here you put every single Cyclone that you have. It looks like you just put the positive ends to here and then the negative to that negative battery post I just showed you, and then the rest goes to your battery, and this has one big main fuse on there as well. I am not going to need this, but I'm definitely gonna probably keep this because I can use this harness at some point somewhere else. These are your Cyclones. Very, very simple. You just have negative, positive, and you have these plug and play connectors that goes to your harness. Also, the cover comes out. In fact, I am switching these white ones out and I bought some amber ones. And that is how I'm running mine. Now you do get a couple of brackets as well. Just gives you a ton of flexibility when mounting your Cyclones. You get your standard L bracket, and then you also get this flat bracket, which as you can see kind of dips down right here. That's great because when you mount this thing up and then you put your Cyclones down here, you need the space for the wiring so the wiring is not getting squished. I, however, decided to do something different. I decided to buy KC Highlights Cyclone magnet mounts. These are awesome because this will allow me to mount my Cyclones anywhere underneath the vehicle without having to drill any extra holes or find any mounting positions. I can put my Cyclones wherever I want. And if you're worried about these not being strong enough, oh, they are, because I've tested it already. I plopped them on there and they're very difficult to move. But you want that. You want magnets that will be able to hold without it just popping off as soon as you have some vibration or if you hit a bump. Now, one other thing that I did get, I got a couple of these Cyclone mounts, and this, you don't have to necessarily get these. You can just mount the Cyclones wherever because it has, a hole right down the middle. But I am mounting 2 of them on my front bumper, and on my front bumper, I originally put the Light Force Rock 9s, a pair of them on the front, and I drilled holes through my bumper in order to mount those. Well, now that there's 2 holes there, if I only put a Cyclone on one of them, the other hole will definitely be visible, and I don't want that. So one way to cover up both of those holes is to use one of these mounts. You just basically put this on there and you have this setup like this. This is actually metal, so it's not rubber. If you've ever mounted any rock lights, they usually will come with like a rubber bumper, and they're fine, but they do tend to flex and everything. This is fully metal, so that's not going to flex on you, but it does come with like a rubber backing so that wherever you're mounting this to, you're not getting like metal on metal kind of scraping. You do have some protection there. Now in the middle, there's also a threaded hole, and that's how you basically mount this onto here. So we mount this first, go ahead and put this through, put this on there, and then you take the bolt that it comes with and mount it in the middle, and that's how you secure this. So how I'm wiring up the rock lights, let me just give you a synopsis on my existing setup. So I have two batteries in the vehicle. I have my starter battery and then I have a secondary house battery. How I hooked both of these up, I did a whole series on a dual battery setup. Go and watch that, because if you've been thinking about getting a dual battery setup for a while, get it. It is definitely so convenient and is such a game changer. Now on my starter battery, I have a switch pod. It's an ignition driven switch pod, which means I gotta put the key in the ignition and then turn it on in order for me to activate any of these lights. When the vehicle is running, the alternator is basically charging up the battery, so I can run these lights for as long as I want, as long as the engine is running, and it's not gonna kill that starter battery. The problem, again, is when we get to camp and I want to turn on my rock lights or my roof lights or even my rear lights. That is now killing the starter battery because the engine's not running. Now, as of right now, I have 6 rock lights that are installed on this particular switch pod. And all we're doing today, we're not messing with any of the wiring. All the wiring is already there. We're just going to replace the Light Force rock lights I already have with 6 KC Hilites Cyclones. And that's it. Plug and play, done. Now for the secondary battery, I installed a switch pod on there as well. And if you want to watch how I set that up, watch the video prior to this one, because in that video, I took 2 more KC Hilites Cyclones and I put one underneath the vehicle on each side, and I plugged it to that switch pod so that at camp I can flick those lights on and it'll run off the secondary battery, and I can pretty much run it all night if I wanted to. So basically there's going to be 8 rock lights underneath the vehicle, 6 of which we use for off-road and 2 we're using at camp. For the rock lights, first thing was to remove the existing ones. It's when I realized I actually drilled 4 holes in the bumper for each light. But it's okay, the mounts I got should cover all of them just fine. Next, I used 2 of the Cyclone harnesses and routed them through one of the holes and then to the switch pod in the engine bay. Now I just needed to plug up the Cyclones to that harness and mount it. To my luck, those holes actually worked out, as I used the top one for wiring and the bottom one to mount the Cyclone itself. For the side of the vehicle, I used the existing wiring already there. The magnet mounts came in super handy because I could now just place the Cyclones wherever I wanted on the frame. So here are the FE1s, and I just have to say these are probably the nicest roof lights I've ever owned. I mean, look at them. They just look so good. But what makes this special is that this actually has 2 lights in it. You have a bright white light that you can use for off-road, but you also have a dimmer amber glow that you can use at camp. See, the problem I have right now is that when we get to camp, I need to turn on my roof lights so that I can see things, and then everybody's like, oh my god, turn those off, they're so bright. But they have to be, because when you're off-roading, you want to be able to see on both sides of the vehicle. Well, with the dimmer amber glow, I can turn those on at camp, and it's a lot more subdued and easier on the eyes. Now inside the connector, you'll see there's 3 pins. One of them is going to be your negative, and that's going to basically ground this whole system. And then you have 1 positive for the bright white lights, and then you'll have 1 positive for the dimmer amber glow lights. Now what makes this also special is the lens. These lenses are interchangeable. This one is considered the spread. It's basically between flood and spot, but they give you 2 other lenses for spot and flood. So you can mess with these and figure out which one you like best. This one I believe is spread, and this one is for spot. So however it is you want to run your lights, you can change out the lens, and that's what kind of pattern you're going to get. There's also this bevel right here. This one is your standard KC Hilites yellow, which I actually really love. But if that's not your vibe, they also have a black one if you want like a blacked out look. And then they also have a red and a blue. And then thirdly, you can also buy different covers. So you obviously have your regular cover here. You can also get a clear one if you don't want to have to keep taking this on and off, but you want to protect the lens. Or you can also get ambers like I did, and that basically just locks on like that. All in all, that's probably the most versatile roof lights you will ever own, just because of how much customization you can do to it. Now for the wiring of the FE1s, that's going to be a little bit more involved. So back to our existing setup, starter battery and house battery. As of right now, I have 4 roof lights and my rear lights attached to the switch pod up here. Again, ignition has to be on in order for those to activate. But because the FE1s has a secondary, basically a backlighting of an amber glow, there is a third wire that's coming out of the FE1s that we can route that to the secondary battery. So basically out of the FE1s, you have your negative wire, that's gonna go to this switch pod. Then you have one wire that's also going to the switch pod. And when I click that switch pod on, those bright white lights turn on. But then that third wire, we're gonna run that down to the secondary switch pod so that when I turn that button on, only the ambers glow. That just means I need to build a wiring harness made up of just one wire running from this switch pod to all 4 FE1s that I'm gonna mount on the roof. And then basically I'm gonna repeat the exact same wiring setup for the FE1s that I'm gonna use as my rear lights. Alright, so I have my roof light wiring here just dangling so that it's ready to get wired up to the FE1s. I also have another one back here for the rear lighting. All of these need to be converted to a 3-pin terminal instead of a 2 because we need to run 3 wires to the FE1s. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run that third wire from my dual battery setup that's back here, get it throughout the Jeep, get that ready and kind of lined up with each of these wires, convert it to a 3-pin, and then we'll be able to connect the FE1s to it and get it running. I want a clean install, so I decided to drill a hole in the roof to run the wires through to the switch pod in the rear of the vehicle. Since I was already drilling a hole, I decided to use that same hole to run my WeBoost antenna wiring through as well. It's something I've been meaning to do for a while. Now I ran a 12 gauge wire through for the FE1 amber lights and ran that to the switch pod but just didn't connect it yet. On the other end of it, outside, I attached a 1-wire connector. I did this so that if I ever need to replace my roof lights in the future, I can just disconnect the harness without having to remove any wiring going through the roof, as I'll be sealing it with silicone later. Now this next part is not something you have to do, I'm actually doing it for you. I needed to figure out which pin is the ground, which one is for the amber light, and which one is for the white light, so I'm cutting open one of the FE1s to find out. I could have contacted KC customer support to get this information, but it was a weekend and no one's gonna be answering. Besides, I can repin it all and seal it up again later. But for those that want to know, this is the orientation of the wires when you're looking at it from the back of the connector. Now that I know which wire is what, it's time to create the harness for the amber lights. There are 4 wires of different lengths that will go to all 4 FE1s on my roof. On one end of each of them, I soldered on the 3-pin connector to the wire that will power on the ambers. Then I took the other end of all 4 wires and soldered them together and then attached the 1-wire connector that will connect to the wire going through the roof I routed earlier. Alright, so I'm going to demonstrate with the rear light install because it's hard for me to get a camera up on the roof to show you exactly what I'm doing. But this basically applies to all the FE1s that we're installing today. So these are the wires that went to my rear lights before. They're attached to the switch pod. This is the front of the vehicle attached to the starter battery. So I'm going to take this wire and I'm going to attach this to the switch pod that's in the back of the vehicle that's attached to my dual battery setup. And I'm going to combine it with these two and put it to a 3-pin connector that will attach to the back of this. Which is also why I made a harness here. This is a roof harness for just the one light, the amber light, and I'm going to combine these with the existing harnesses up there now from my roof lights before. And this is also going to go to the switch pod in the back of the vehicle to my dual battery. That's pretty much it. It's really, really simple once you see it kind of all laid out. Same as I did earlier with the harness, I soldered on a 3-pin connector to the 3 wires. 2 of which powered my rear lights before, and then the 1 wire that will power the amber light. Then I mounted the light, first the bracket and then the light to that bracket, and when that was done, connected the white wire to my rear switch pod, plugged up the connector, and then ran my test. Now it's time to repeat that process for the roof lights. First I plugged up that harness I just made. Then I routed all those wires to all 4 corners of the roof rack where I'll have a light. Next I attached the 2 existing wiring I had before to the new 3-pin connector. Finally, I mounted up all the lights, and all that was left after that was to connect that 1 wire we ran through the roof into my rear switch pod. and the conversion is complete. And wow, it's like a night and day difference. And don't get me wrong, I loved my setup before when everything was light force, but now that it's all KC, it just, the Jeep looks so different, but also it looks just as good. I am super happy with this, especially with the FE1s because of how the FE1s function. I now have roof lights when we're night wheeling, but I also have roof lights that I can use at camp because of the two modes that those lights have. Now there's a good chance you might not be installing your FE1s the same way I did. Not everybody has a dual battery setup with two switch pods in their vehicle. You do have a couple of options. Option number one, if you do have a switch pod already, you can take the positive wire for the amber glow and then the positive wire of the white, the bright whites, and put them into two separate terminals on your switch pod. Now on your switch pod, you'll have two buttons, one for each of those lights. Or you can kind of create your own harness where you have two buttons, one for the amber glow and one for the bright whites. Or you can also buy a 3 toggle switch and then put everything to that, and you have 3 positions on the switch. Or you can just make it completely easy on yourself and buy KC Hilites FE1 harness. That goes to, I think, 4 or 2 different lights, however you want to configure it. And it already comes with a 3 toggle switch, so you just press one and then it'll go to amber, then you press it again and it'll go to bright whites. Again, tons of different options on how you want to install yours. Me, I love to set up bright whites when we're hitting the trails. I can hit that on my main switch pod, and then the amber glow at camp, which is tied up to my second switch pod, and that'll stay on without me having to put the key in the ignition. I think that is just the perfect setup for how it is I run my lights. I do want to give a huge shout out to Nomadism and to KC Hilites for giving me the opportunity to install their products on this vehicle. I mean, these are premium lights. These are one of the best you're going to get, and I am so honored that they chose me to kind of help spearhead the new Nomadism brand. For the rest of you, make sure you check out Nomadism. They have a ton of stuff on there, not just KC Hilites stuff, but a whole bunch of, I mean, basically go to Nomadism for all of your overlanding needs. Rooftop tents, roof racks, whatever it is you need, go to Nomadism because their catalog is growing every single day. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure you smash, actually don't smash, KC highlight that like button, subscribe to our channel, click that notification bell so we can let you be aware of new videos when they come out, and if it moves you, support us on Patreon. It gives you access to all of our videos before everyone else and gives you access to our live streams when we do them. And as always, don't forget to follow us on Instagram at BeastSuburban4601. My name is Asia Sampson, and I will see you next time.